Some stories begin in castles, others in cities, but this one begins in the forest. In the quiet woods near Jedburgh, Scotland, a small group has appeared, a group calling themselves the Kingdom of Kubala. They claim this land as their ancestral home. To outsiders, it may seem like a protest. To skeptics, perhaps a fantasy. But for those who came here, it is a calling, a mission that they say connects them to history, identity, and a past long erased. In early 2025, residents began noticing something unusual. Tents scattered among the trees, chants echoing in the early morning, and a trio dressed in robes carrying themselves as royalty. At the heart of this movement were a man and a woman calling themselves King Atehine and Queen Nandi. Alongside them was a young woman, Cora Taylor, now known as Asnat. They assert that this forest is more than land. It is a claim to dignity, to ancestry, to recognition that they say was denied centuries ago. Many initially thought it was symbolic, even theatrical, perhaps a cultural statement, a protest, or a social experiment. But soon, the reality became more complex. Eviction notices arrived. Local authorities declared the encampment illegal. And yet, the group refused to leave. Suddenly, what began as a quiet curiosity became a national story, raising questions that touch on law, faith, and the meaning of heritage. The kingdom's camp was small, almost fragile, but their claim was immense, not just about the ground beneath their feet, but about history itself. To understand their argument, you must understand the echo of centuries past. Scotland, like much of Europe, has seen its land change hands countless times. Feudal decrees, inheritance, war, and politics have all shaped ownership. Centuries ago, these borders may have seemed immutable, but in the eyes of Kubala's leaders, the mistakes and displacements of history are not closed chapters. They are unresolved debts. In Africa, colonial borders tore families and kingdoms apart. People were displaced, cultures disrupted, and land claimed by others. These historical wounds did not end on the continent. They traveled with the diaspora, echoing across oceans, across generations. And now, in modern-day Scotland, that history has found an unlikely stage, a small forest, a camp, and three people who say they're reclaiming what was once theirs. Among them, Cora Taylor, a 21-year-old from Texas, has captured particular attention. Once a student with a bright future, she is now known as Asnat, the handmaiden of a king. Her mother has publicly expressed alarm, calling her involvement coercive and warning of dangerous influence. The young woman herself maintains that she is here by choice, committed to the kingdom's mission. Her story raises difficult questions. What drives a young person to abandon home and family? Where does belief end and influence begin? And how does one measure the line between faith and fanaticism? The Kingdom of Kubala is more than tents and robes. It is a collision between law and faith, past and present, myth and reality. Eviction orders and legal battles mount. Public opinion is divided, and the world watches with a mixture of fascination, skepticism, and disbelief. Yet, amid all this attention, one truth remains. The Kingdom of Kubala has forced a confrontation with ideas we often take for granted about ownership, heritage, justice, and identity. And as the first eviction looms and the authorities prepare to act, one question echoes louder than all others. Is this merely a protest or a reckoning? Every movement begins with an idea, and often with two people who believe they were chosen to bring it to life. Before the forests of Scotland, before the headlines and the controversy, there was Kofi Afe and Jean Gasho, the self-proclaimed king and queen of Kubala. They are not strangers to the public eye. For years, Jean Gasho had written online about her life, her faith, and her views on justice, womanhood, and spirituality. Kofi Afe, a Ghanaian-born man living in the United Kingdom, often appeared beside her, quiet, devout, yet intense in his convictions. Together, they began weaving a theology that blended African heritage with Christian mysticism. In their eyes, the modern world was built upon spiritual theft. The land, the faith, and even the image of God itself had been taken, misused, and distorted. Their writings reflect a mix of personal history, spirituality, and a deep desire to reclaim identity. They often spoke of ancestral calls, dreams that guided them, and visions that seemed to point toward a specific mission. Their journey toward founding the Kingdom of Kubala began long before they set foot in that Scottish forest. For years, they had spoken of visions, of dreams pointing them toward a divine calling. They believed they had been chosen to restore a lost order, to reconnect Africa's descendants to lands they say were taken. To many observers, their message seemed radical. To them, it was revelation. It was destiny. In one of her early writings, Jean described feeling trapped between two worlds, African and Western, and said that neither had offered her peace. She wrote of a deep ancestral pull, an urge to return to origins not bound by geography, but by spirit. Kofi, too, spoke of hearing a divine voice, a command to reclaim what was taken. That phrase, reclaim what was taken, became the seed of everything that followed. Together, they envisioned a kingdom that was more than a territory. It was a revival of culture, faith, and order, disrupted by centuries of displacement. By late 2024, the couple had started calling themselves King Atehine and Queen Nandi. They said their union was not merely marital, but prophetic, a royal appointment from God and their ancestors. They claimed to represent the rebirth of an ancient African kingdom hidden by centuries of colonial domination and silence. Its name, Kubala. They said Kubala was more than a nation. It was a restoration of divine order. To them, every royal title of Europe, every land claim and crown had its origin in Africa, and Kubala was the proof that history had been rewritten. The announcement was first made online. Jean, now Queen Nandi, wrote that the Kingdom of Kubala would rise again, beginning with a symbolic act, the reclamation of land. She said Scotland was chosen not by chance, but by prophecy, that the ancestors had shown them visions of a northern land, where the earth itself called out for restoration. Soon, their message gained a following online, small but passionate. To some, it was a spiritual awakening. To others, a dangerous delusion. But Kofi and Jean remained resolute. They said they were no longer part of this world's system. In early 2025, they packed their belongings and left their home in northern England. With little more than camping equipment and conviction, they headed for Scotland. What they were about to do would shock both local authorities and the wider world. They called it the founding of Kubala. On arrival, they declared the forest near Jedburgh as sovereign territory, the restored kingdom of Kubala. Kofi stood as King Atehine, Jean as Queen Nandi, and with them was Kaora Taylor, who now went by the name Asnat, the royal handmaiden, whom they described as divinely chosen. Their first statement, posted to social media, claimed that Kubala was not subject to British law. They said they had returned to the land of their ancestors, fulfilling a sacred prophecy, one that predated empire itself. Their words were absolute. We have come to reclaim the land stolen from our African ancestors. The blood that was shed cries out from the ground. We are here to restore what was taken. Videos soon followed, short clips filmed in the woods showing their daily rituals, prayers, and proclamations. They spoke of the lost children of Africa, scattered by slavery and empire, now called to return and take back what belonged to them. To their supporters, this was a moment of spiritual power, a modern exodus. To their critics, it was fantasy, even deception. Their ideology, though strange to some, touched on real historical trauma. For centuries, Africa's lands were divided, its people displaced. Generations were stripped not only of home, but of heritage, told that the earth beneath their feet was not theirs. Kubala, they said, was not about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about remembering. Their beliefs also carried tension. They rejected any form of external authority, government, police, even organized religion. To them, all were systems of corruption. King Atehine declared that the kingdom of Kubala was sovereign under divine law, and that any attempt to remove them would be an attack on God's will. Online, their following grew. Some found in their words a sense of identity and empowerment. Others warned that the couple was spiraling deeper into isolation and delusion. Experts on new religious movements began to take notice, comparing Kubala to apocalyptic sects, movements born from trauma, sustained by prophecy, and often ending in confrontation. Yet to dismiss Kubala purely as madness is to ignore the world that made it possible. In a society still wrestling with the shadows of empire, and where many feel disconnected from roots, messages like theirs find fertile ground. People crave belonging. They crave meaning. And sometimes, that search leads to the edge of reason. Kubala became a place where faith, identity, and history converged. By March of 2025, Kubala's camp had become both sanctuary and spectacle. Supporters visited to pray and record. Critics arrived to film and expose. Police came to serve warnings. And through it all, King Atehine and Queen Nandi stood firm, regal, unyielding, and certain that the world would one day recognize Kubala as more than a protest. They said it was destiny. The birth of the kingdom was complete. But the question lingered. What happens when belief meets the law? When a dream of restoration collides with the rules of the modern world? For the followers of Kubala, faith was now everything. For the authorities, it was trespass. And as the days passed, the tension between those two truths would only grow stronger. The kingdom of Kubala had been born, but its future and its legacy remained uncertain. When news of the kingdom of Kubala reached Jedburgh, it was met with a mix of confusion, curiosity, and concern. For a small Scottish town, centuries removed from Africa, yet steeped in its own history of land disputes, the arrival of a self-proclaimed African kingdom in the local forest was unprecedented. Residents reported seeing tents and makeshift structures among the trees, royal robes, and a small entourage proclaiming sovereignty over the land. Some were intrigued, others were alarmed. Local shopkeepers described seeing a small group performing ceremonies in the forest early in the morning. Commuters passing through noted unusual activity, chanting, flags, and symbols unfamiliar to the community. It was strange, one resident later said. At first, we thought it was a film crew, but it wasn't. It was real people claiming this land. Jedburgh's council quickly became aware. Officials reviewed local records and determined that the forest in question was privately owned and legally subject to Scottish law. The group, however, insisted that divine law, not human law, governed their actions. Within days, the council issued the first eviction notices. These legal documents cited trespass and unauthorized occupation of private property. Under Scottish land law, property rights are strictly enforced. Even in cases of disputed ownership or historical claims, formal legal procedures must be followed. The authorities made clear that while individuals are free to express beliefs, occupying land without permission constitutes a legal violation. Police officers were called to the forest to monitor activity and ensure public safety. Early encounters were cautious and measured. Officers reported no immediate violence, but tensions were rising. The kingdom's leaders refused to comply with initial requests to leave, insisting that the land was theirs by ancestral right. They argued that the eviction notice had no authority over them because their claim predated any modern law. This stance created a complex legal dilemma. How do you enforce property rights against individuals asserting spiritual and historical ownership? Legal experts explained the situation further. Dr. Fiona McLaren, a scholar of Scottish land law, noted, "The law recognizes ownership through deeds and historical claims, but it does not accommodate religious or ancestral assertions without legal documentation. Occupying land without permission, regardless of belief, is considered trespass. The authorities are obliged to act." Other experts emphasized that historical ownership claims are often more complicated than they appear. Across Scotland, land records can date back centuries, and disputes over titles or boundaries are common. Yet courts typically rely on documented ownership rather than symbolic or spiritual claims. The public reaction in Jedburgh was a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some residents sympathized with the kingdom's message of reclaiming heritage, especially considering Africa's history of displacement and colonization. Others feared escalation. Local news outlets interviewed community members who expressed concern over safety, sanitation, and the legality of the camp. Social media quickly amplified these reactions, and online discussions ranged from support to ridicule. A spokesperson for the local council stated, "We respect people's beliefs, but this land is privately owned, and the law must be upheld. We are working to ensure the situation is resolved peacefully." As eviction notices were formally delivered, the Kingdom of Kubala held meetings in the forest to discuss next steps. Video clips posted online showed King Atehine addressing followers, emphasizing faith, duty, and destiny. He said, "We stand not for ourselves, but for the memory of our ancestors." Queen Nandi reinforced the message, "We do not fear earthly law. Our authority comes from a higher power. This land speaks to us. We will not abandon it." The authorities, meanwhile, prepared for potential escalation, aware that confrontations could occur if the group refused to comply. Legal scholars weighed in on the nuances of the situation. Dr. Hamish Grant, an expert in property and historical claims, explained, "This is a fascinating intersection of law and belief. In Scotland, historical land claims require documentation, deeds, records of ownership, legal precedents. Spiritual or ancestral claims are not recognized in courts. That said, enforcement must be measured, and authorities often prefer negotiation and dialogue before escalation. This highlighted the delicate balance, enforcing law while avoiding unnecessary conflict with a group claiming religious and ancestral legitimacy. The kingdom's occupation also raised questions about international attention. Social media users worldwide were fascinated by the story. A small Scottish forest, a self-proclaimed African kingdom, and a young American woman as royal handmaiden. Journalists noted that the story resonated with broader discussions about identity, belonging, and post-colonial reparations. While authorities focused on legal enforcement, observers were debating whether Kubala represented activism, spiritual conviction, or delusion. On the ground, the first formal interactions with police were carefully coordinated. Officers arrived during daylight hours, clearly identified, and attempted dialogue with the group. King Atehine spoke directly to the officers, insisting that the forest had been chosen by divine command. Queen Nandi added that any attempt to remove them would violate sacred law. While no physical confrontation occurred, these exchanges set the stage for a tense standoff, drawing attention from both local authorities and international media. Legal documents delivered during this period outlined property boundaries, ownership, and potential penalties for non-compliance. The notices emphasized that trespassing could lead to fines, arrests, or court orders. The kingdom's leadership rejected the notices, arguing that earthly documentation was irrelevant to divine authority. This raised complicated questions for lawyers and officials. How do you uphold law when the occupant's belief system does not recognize it? Experts in religious studies pointed out that movements like Kubala are not unique in history. From sectarian groups in Europe to spiritual movements in Africa, claims of divine land ownership often collide with civil law. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a sociologist specializing in new religious movements, explained, "Groups asserting spiritual sovereignty frequently challenge authorities. Their claims may have no legal foundation, but they are deeply meaningful to followers. Understanding the psychology and sociology behind such movements is critical to managing conflicts peacefully." Public reaction continued to evolve. Local residents began documenting their own experiences, some expressing fear, others curiosity. Social media amplified these accounts, sparking debates about legality, spirituality, and the role of ancestral claims in modern society. News outlets reported on the unfolding situation daily, framing the story as both unusual and thought-provoking. The kingdom's growing online presence added pressure on authorities to act carefully, balancing enforcement with caution. As legal preparations progressed, Scottish authorities coordinated with landowners to ensure any action was legally sound. Plans for potential court proceedings were discussed, and contingency measures were put in place in case of resistance. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Kubala continued its daily routines, prayers, rituals, and online broadcasts. Their message remained consistent: The land was theirs, and their mission was divinely sanctioned. Observers noted the careful choreography of these public statements, suggesting that the kingdom understood the power of narrative in influencing both followers and critics. The first court filings were submitted in March 2025, requesting formal enforcement of property rights. The legal filings documented the ownership history of the forest, tracing deeds, transfers, and rights through decades. Lawyers emphasized that while the group's claims were imaginative and rooted in personal belief, Scottish property law was clear. Ownership and use were subject to documented legal rights. The tension between law and faith, history and ideology had reached a formal stage. The Scottish response was no longer just about police warnings. It was now in the legal domain, setting the foundation for potential eviction proceedings. As the story developed, journalists and commentators highlighted broader implications. The situation touched on post-colonial consciousness, spiritual reclamation, and the ways in which historical displacement continues to resonate across generations. While the legal system focused on deeds and law, the world watched a different kind of claim unfold, one grounded in identity, history, and belief. The Scottish response demonstrated a careful, procedural approach, respect for human rights, adherence to legal codes, and measured engagement with a group whose beliefs challenged conventional authority. Yet the authorities also made it clear that the law would not bend. The boundaries between lawful property rights and spiritual conviction were sharply defined, setting up an inevitable confrontation between state enforcement and personal belief. Among the most controversial aspects of the Kingdom of Kubala was the presence of Kubala Taylor, a young woman from Texas who had traveled thousands of miles to join the self-proclaimed royal family in Scotland. Her journey became a focal point for critics who argued that Kubala was not just a spiritual mission, but a system that exerted influence over vulnerable individuals. Kubala, who now went by the name Asnat within the kingdom, left her home in the United States after months of online communication with the group. Friends and family described her as independent, intelligent, and ambitious. Yet her sudden relocation to a foreign country, living in a forest with strangers, alarmed those closest to her. Her mother, speaking to local journalists, expressed deep concern. Kubala has been brainwashed. She's not thinking clearly. They've convinced her to abandon everything, family, friends, school, for this fantasy. Statements like these fueled public debates about the line between personal belief and undue influence. Experts in cult dynamics and psychological manipulation weighed in. Dr. Elaine Porter, a specialist in grooming and high-control groups, explained, there are certain characteristics that can indicate manipulative environments: isolation, intense loyalty to leaders, pressure to cut ties with family, and a narrative that presents the group's mission as divinely ordained. She emphasized that these signs do not automatically define a group as a cult, but they do raise questions about the potential for undue influence. Despite her mother's claims, Kubala consistently asserted her agency. In multiple videos posted online, she stated, "I came here by choice. I'm not forced. I believe in what we're doing. This is my path, and I understand the consequences." Her statements highlighted a tension: the outward appearance of free will versus the scrutiny of outside observers concerned about potential coercion. The Kingdom of Kubala itself framed her presence as divinely significant. Queen Nandi described Kubala as a handmaiden chosen by ancestral guidance, meant to support the spiritual mission. To supporters, this was a fulfillment of prophecy. To critics, it was evidence of hierarchical control. Members of the Jedburgh community noted that Kubala participated in rituals alongside the couple, often in a visible and active role. Videos showed her assisting in ceremonies, addressing followers, and helping manage daily camp life. These activities were central to the kingdom's portrayal of legitimacy, reinforcing the perception that it was a functioning spiritual entity rather than a casual protest. Scholars studying new religious movements emphasized the importance of distinguishing voluntary affiliation from coercion. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a sociologist specializing in religious studies, explained, individuals may willingly join groups that outsiders view as extreme. The critical factor is whether there is evidence of manipulation or restriction of choice. Public statements, like Cowra's, need to be considered alongside family concerns and independent observations. Cora's mother described a growing fear that her daughter had been recruited into a high-control environment. She recounted phone calls in which Cora expressed unwavering loyalty to the kingdom and a refusal to consider leaving. "She tells me she's happy," her mother said, "but I don't know if it's really happiness or if she's under pressure to say that." This duality between the individual's expressed choice and familial concern became a recurring theme in media coverage. Legal experts pointed out that in Scotland, adults are generally considered capable of making their own decisions, even if family members disagree. As long as there is no evidence of coercion or criminal activity, authorities are limited in what actions they can take to remove someone from a situation voluntarily chosen. Psychologists noted that young adults, especially those seeking purpose or belonging, can be drawn to charismatic figures and tightly knit communities. Dr. Porter commented, "The combination of spiritual belief, personal charisma, and social reinforcement can create a strong sense of commitment. It does not inherently mean someone is being manipulated, but it can make leaving emotionally challenging." Cora herself remained consistent in her messaging. She described the kingdom as a place of learning, spiritual growth, and community. In her own words, "I feel connected here. I understand why people might be worried, but this is my life. I made my choice, and I stand by it." Her public defense made it clear that, at least outwardly, she was exercising her agency. The media, however, often framed her story in the context of potential exploitation. Headlines highlighted her age, her distance from home, and the dramatic nature of her relocation. Commentators debated whether the kingdom's structure crossed into coercion or whether Cowra's participation was fully voluntary. Experts emphasize that such situations are rarely clear-cut. The intersection of belief, family concern, and legal autonomy creates a gray area where judgment is difficult. Dr. Sinclair explained, "We must recognize that individuals can be both autonomous and deeply influenced by their environment." Cowra's case illustrates this tension vividly. Public opinion remained divided. Online forums saw heated debates, some supporting Cowra's right to self-determination, others condemning the kingdom as manipulative. Videos and interviews with Cowra underscored her commitment to the group, showing her engaging in teaching, ceremonies, and social outreach within the kingdom. Authorities monitored the situation carefully, aware that any perception of coercion could trigger intervention. Yet, as adults are legally empowered to make their own choices, there was little the police could do if Cowra consistently asserted her free will. The kingdom's narrative framed Cowra's presence as essential to their legitimacy. They described her role as both symbolic and practical, reinforcing their story of divine mission and ancestral restoration. For supporters, she was evidence that the kingdom was attracting believers who shared its vision. For critics, she represented vulnerability exploited by a high-control environment. This duality, Cora's stated autonomy versus familial and public concern, became central to the discussion about Kubala. It raised broader questions about how society interprets voluntary affiliation, belief systems, and influence. Was Cora a willing participant in a spiritual mission, or was she a victim of subtle persuasion, caught in a system designed to consolidate authority? Throughout this period, Cora remained firm in her choices, attending rituals, participating in leadership discussions, and addressing followers online. Her visible presence reinforced the kingdom's image as a functioning spiritual community, with clear hierarchy and defined roles. Meanwhile, her family continued to appeal to public and media attention, hoping that awareness might influence her decision. Interviews highlighted the emotional complexity, love and concern for Cora, frustration at her choices, and fear for her safety. This tension between personal belief, family concern, and public scrutiny would continue to define Cora's narrative within the kingdom of Kubala. Whether seen as a devoted follower, a symbolic figure, or a young woman caught in an unusual situation. Kora's story became emblematic of the kingdom of Kubala itself, a place where faith, identity, and controversy intertwined, challenging observers to separate belief from manipulation, choice from coercion, and devotion from delusion. The morning of October 2nd, 2025, dawned tense over the forest near Jedburgh. For weeks, local authorities had coordinated with legal teams, ensuring that any intervention would follow proper procedures. For the kingdom of Kubala, however, it was the day that would change everything. Police officers, accompanied by immigration officials, arrived at the forest at first light. Vehicles lined the forest edge, their presence marked by flashing lights and uniforms that contrasted sharply with the tents, makeshift structures, and colorful banners of the self-proclaimed kingdom. The group inside the camp had been forewarned by social media speculation and sporadic news leaks, but the formal arrival of authorities still prompted a mixture of anxiety and defiance. King Atehine and Queen Nandi met the officers at the forest edge, robes flowing, standing tall in ceremonial posture. They had rehearsed words, gestures, and proclamations, prepared for the confrontation that many had predicted. Videos taken by onlookers captured the scene, a surreal tableau of law enforcement facing a self-proclaimed monarchy, asserting divine sovereignty. The authorities began by issuing formal orders to vacate the property. The notices were read aloud, citing trespass, immigration violations, and potential criminal liability. They emphasized that failure to comply would result in arrests. King Atehine responded, stating firmly, "This land belongs to our ancestors. We answer only to God and the laws that predate this nation. You have no authority here." Queen Nandi added, "We will not abandon the sacred mission entrusted to us. Our allegiance is eternal. Leave or witness the consequences." Despite the rhetoric, officers proceeded carefully, balancing enforcement with caution. The camp was systematically cleared. Tents were dismantled, personal belongings were packed into police vehicles, and areas used for rituals were secured. The scene was dramatic, yet controlled. Authorities reported no immediate violence, but tensions remained high. Videos and photos quickly circulated online, showing the dismantling of a camp that had become symbolic for followers worldwide. During the operation, arrests were made. King Atehine was taken into custody for trespassing and immigration violations. Kawara Taylor, now identified publicly as Asnat, was also arrested after initially refusing to leave. Queen Nandi, who was not present during the initial sweep, later cooperated with authorities, emphasizing that she wished to avoid confrontation. The arrests were procedural but deeply symbolic. The physical removal of leaders represented the dismantling of the kingdom's claim to sovereignty. Public reactions were immediate and polarized. Social media exploded with commentary. Supporters of Kubala framed the raid as persecution, a modern echo of colonial oppression, a denial of spiritual and cultural reclamation. Hashtags proliferated, and videos shared by onlookers went viral. Many viewers expressed outrage, calling for recognition of ancestral rights and criticizing the government for heavy-handed action. Conversely, critics argued that the raid was necessary to enforce the law. Editorials in Scottish newspapers described the group as operating outside legal bounds, emphasizing the importance of property rights, safety, and immigration compliance. Online debates also touched on broader societal issues: race, identity, freedom of belief, and the intersection of spirituality and legality. The kingdom's narrative became a catalyst for conversations far beyond Jedburgh. Journalists covered the raid live, interviewing residents, officials, and legal experts. Local council members explained that their priority had been peaceful resolution, but the law demanded action. Police officers emphasized professionalism, highlighting that safety was paramount for both officers and camp occupants. The kingdom's followers responded with a mix of defiance and sorrow. Many posted messages online mourning the dismantling of a sacred space. Some traveled to Jedburgh to protest, while others stayed home, documenting events virtually. These reactions illustrated the power of digital networks. A small forest in Scotland became the center of global attention within hours. Legal analysts discussed the implications. Dr. Fiona McLaren noted, "The arrests reinforce the principle that property law and immigration regulations take precedence in civil society." However, the cultural and spiritual dimensions of this case highlight tensions between individual belief and state authority. Other experts emphasize that public perception matters as much as legal authority. A raid that might be routine in other contexts became a media spectacle precisely because of the kingdom's online presence and symbolic framing. Videos captured the final moments in the camp. King Atehine was guided to police vehicles, maintaining composure and ceremonial posture. Asnat/Cowra was similarly escorted, her face calm, sometimes waving to supporters recording from a distance. Observers remarked on the surreal juxtaposition, a modern law enforcement operation intersecting with a medieval-style royal proclamation. Following the raid, media outlets began analyzing the story from multiple perspectives. Some framed it as a cautionary tale about online radicalization, spiritual movements, and the power of charismatic leaders. Others explored the racial and historical dimensions, emphasizing Africa's history of displacement and the longing for ancestral reconnection. Podcasts, news shows, and social media commentaries debated the kingdom's legitimacy, the ethics of law enforcement, and the rights of adults to choose alternative lifestyles. The raid also prompted discussion about digital media's role in amplifying events. Video clips, live streams, and social media posts allowed global audiences to witness events in near real time. Analysts noted that this amplification could both empower followers and intensify scrutiny. Supporters of Kubala framed the raid as a direct attack on identity, spirituality, and freedom. Online petitions circulated, calling for recognition of the kingdom's mission, while commentators drew parallels with historical struggles for self-determination. Legal experts clarified the consequences of the arrests. King Atehine and Asnat faced charges related to trespass, immigration, and potential violations of public order. Court proceedings were expected to follow, with careful attention to due process. Authorities emphasized that the action was procedural, not punitive. It was about law enforcement, not belief systems. The kingdom's online communication remained active despite the raid. Videos posted from undisclosed locations showed members discussing the events, reaffirming faith and emphasizing resilience. Queen Nandi posted a statement urging followers to remain committed. "They can take the land, but they cannot take our faith. Kubala lives in spirit and in action." These messages underscored the ongoing narrative that physical removal did not equate to spiritual defeat. Commentators debated the raid's impact on discussions about freedom, belief, and the limits of state authority. Dr. Margaret Sinclair noted, "This situation highlights the collision between law, identity, and belief. When individuals create spaces that challenge conventional authority, society must navigate enforcement, perception, and respect for personal conviction." Public reaction remained polarized for weeks. Social media hashtags surged, op-eds debated historical and racial contexts, and international observers tracked the story closely. While local authorities focused on legal outcomes, the kingdom's story had already transcended geography, becoming a symbol of tension between belief, law, and identity. The raid of October 2, 2025 marked a turning point. The kingdom of Kubala, once a secluded camp in a Scottish forest, had been forcibly dismantled. Leaders were in custody, followers scattered. Yet the story continued. Online, in media, and in public discourse. The events of that day would be analyzed, debated, and remembered as both a legal enforcement operation and a moment where faith, identity, and sovereignty collided in dramatic fashion. After the dramatic raid and arrests, attention turned to the message that had drawn followers to the kingdom of Kubala in the first place. The ideology behind the movement was at once spiritual, cultural, and political, a unique fusion that reflected both personal belief and historical consciousness. King Atehine and Queen Nandi articulated a worldview grounded in ancestral reclamation. They claimed that African descendants had been severed from their roots by centuries of slavery, colonization, and cultural erasure. To them, Kubala was not merely a physical location. It was a statement, a living symbol of restoration, and a call to reconnect with ancestral land, identity, and spirituality. The group's assertion of being a lost African tribe became central to their narrative. According to their declarations, Kubala was the continuation of a sovereign African lineage, hidden and suppressed through time. They emphasized rituals, symbols, and titles meant to evoke historical authority, and described their movement as a bridge between Africa and its diaspora, a spiritual and cultural homecoming. Followers of Kubala embraced these ideas passionately. Social media posts, videos, and writings reflected a deep sense of belonging, empowerment, and purpose. Many expressed that participation provided a connection to heritage that they had long felt was absent in their lives. For them, Kubala symbolized more than a camp in Scotland. It was a spiritual reclamation, a restoration of dignity, and a reminder of what had been lost over centuries. However, critics challenged the historical and factual basis of these claims. Historians and journalists emphasized that there was no documented lineage linking the kingdom of Kubala to a specific lost African tribe, yet the symbolic power of the claim was undeniable. Even without historical proof, the narrative resonated emotionally and spiritually with followers, seeking identity and connection. The Kubala movement echoed themes found in other diaspora return to roots initiatives. Throughout history, African-descended populations have established communities, rituals, and societies to reclaim cultural and spiritual identity. Examples include the Back to Africa movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Rastafari movement in Jamaica, and modern Pan-African spiritual communities. All shared a common theme: the desire to reconnect with lost heritage, affirm identity, and assert sovereignty over cultural narratives. Dr. Marcus Langley, a scholar of diaspora movements, explained, "Movements like Kubala reflect a universal desire among displaced or marginalized communities to reclaim identity. While the forms vary, from religious practice to political activism, the underlying motive is consistent: to resist cultural erasure and assert agency." Kubala's specific fusion of African ancestry, Christian mysticism, and performative sovereignty created both intrigue and controversy. To supporters, these practices validated ancestral connections and offered a framework for understanding personal and collective purpose. To critics, they were seen as theatrical, even deceptive, blending history, myth, and ideology in ways that blurred the line between belief and invention. The symbolism of Kubala extended beyond territory. Rituals, titles, and ceremonies were designed to convey legitimacy, continuity, and spiritual authority. Every action within the kingdom, from prayers in the forest to proclamations of sovereignty, was imbued with meaning for followers. The outside world, however, often interpreted these same actions as eccentric or extreme, highlighting the tension between internal perception and external judgment. The controversy surrounding Kubala also raised questions about freedom of belief and the right to self-determination. Philosophers and legal scholars debated the extent to which adults can form alternative communities, particularly when those communities operate outside conventional social and legal structures. the kingdom became a flashpoint for discussions on the balance between individual liberty, societal norms, and the enforcement of law. Observers noted that the kingdom's narrative leveraged both history and emotion. References to ancestral displacement, colonial legacy, and systemic injustice were central to the movement's appeal. This approach created a compelling story for followers, one in which they were reclaiming agency, honoring their lineage, and actively resisting centuries of erasure. Yet Kubala also highlighted the challenge of reconciling belief with empirical reality. Claims of lineage, prophecy, and divine mandate could not be historically verified. Scholars emphasized that the movement's significance lay less in factual accuracy than in the psychological and social meaning it provided to participants. Media coverage amplified the controversy. International outlets debated whether Kubala was a legitimate spiritual revival, a misguided experiment, or a potential high-control environment. Commentators framed the story within broader conversations about race, heritage, and spirituality, examining how narratives of historical reclamation resonate with audiences today. Online, discussions continued long after the camp was dismantled. Followers shared reflections, testimonies, and reinterpretations of Kubala's practices. For them, the kingdom was alive, in ideas and belief, even if its physical manifestation had been removed. Critics countered with historical analysis, legal scrutiny, and sociological commentary, emphasizing the need to differentiate symbolism from actionable claims. Kubala's leaders emphasized empowerment. They argued that reclaiming identity was a proactive act, a refusal to remain passive in the face of historical displacement. For followers, this framed the movement as a form of resistance, spiritual revival, and communal cohesion. Kubala may no longer occupy a forest, but its story continues, in memory, online, and in the hearts of those who believe. And the world is left to wonder, what truly defines a kingdom? Faith, blood, history, or the courage to reclaim what was thought lost?